The $7 million Ferrari LaFerrari Aperta had been sitting untouched for 3 weeks, not on display but because no one could fix it. Giselle Voss hired 6 world-class specialists, flew in engineers from Italy, and received 6 reports that said the same thing: no fault found. She told the press that no ordinary garage had the expertise to touch her asset. But that Friday afternoon, Caleb Reed, owner of a modest repair shop on Cedar Street, knelt beside the car, listened, and heard the one thing all 6 experts had missed. What was that strange sound, and why was Caleb Reed the only man on earth who could hear it? The storage facility sat at the edge of Giselle Voss's private property, a climate-controlled vault that held 8 vehicles the way a museum holds irreplaceable art. Polished concrete floors, recessed lighting, humidity sensors mounted at every corner, temperature held within a single degree year-round, and at the center of it all, draped in a thin film of dust it had never known before, stood number 47 of 210, a Ferrari LaFerrari Aperta in Rosso Corsa, the rarest production variant ever to leave Maranello. 3 weeks ago it had been alive. Now it simply stood there, silent and immovable, like a creature that had forgotten how to breathe. The car was worth more than most people earned in several lifetimes, and it was completely, inexplicably useless. Giselle walked into the room that Thursday morning with her phone already vibrating in her palm, and she did not look at the car right away. She looked out the narrow window at the gray sky above the hills and let the message from Ryan Ashford load on her screen. The 6th garage had withdrawn. Liability concerns, the message said. They were sorry for the inconvenience. She read it twice, put the phone in her pocket, and finally turned to look at the car. It looked back at her the way expensive things do when they have beaten you, quietly, without apology. A month before, she had been running the car on a private stretch of straight road, testing nothing in particular, simply driving because she needed an hour without anyone asking her questions. The car had been performing perfectly, engine note clean, hybrid system cycling as designed, and then, nothing. No warning light, no shudder, no smoke, no drama. The engine simply stopped communicating with everything attached to it, as though a single thought had been erased from the middle of a sentence. She coasted to a stop and sat in the sudden silence for a long time. The Ferrari's onboard diagnostics returned no fault codes. The ECU log was clean and unblemished. When the first technical team arrived 2 days later from Ferrari's North American Service Division, their lead technician spent 6 hours connected to the car's data ports and found nothing that explained what had happened. He apologized professionally and left. The second team came from Germany and brought more expensive equipment. They also found nothing. The third team was local but highly credentialed. The fourth team arrived from Europe at Giselle's personal invitation. By the fifth team, she had stopped being surprised and started being methodical. She documented every inspection, filed every report, and said nothing publicly until she was certain. Then she summoned 3 journalists she trusted and delivered the statement that would end up in 4 automotive publications by the following morning. The car represented an unsolvable problem, and she was treating it as such. She called it a curiosity rather than a failure, and she phrased it with the precise confidence of someone who has learned that controlling the narrative is the only form of control that never gets taken away. Ryan Ashford stood beside her during that small briefing, with his hands folded at his waist, and his expression set to the specific frequency of a man who agrees with everything his boss says. He had been her deputy at Voss Industries for 3 years, a man whose professional reputation was built on loyalty and attention to detail, and the particular talent for anticipating what needed to be done before being asked to do it. He was the person she trusted most inside the company's structure, and that morning he stood behind her right shoulder while she spoke to the journalists and nodded in all the correct places. When a photographer turned toward the car, the right corner of Ryan's mouth moved upward in a way that had nothing to do with the moment. The expression lasted less than a second. It was not pride and it was not amusement. It was the expression of someone whose plan is proceeding on schedule. Giselle did not see it. She was already answering the next question. She drove back to her office through late afternoon traffic and told herself that the 6th garage withdrawing was not a setback but an elimination. One more name crossed off a list that would eventually reach the right name. That was how she had built Voss Industries from a regional logistics company into a $400 million technology and infrastructure group. That was how she had survived every attempt to diminish her that this industry had produced. Remove the variables, narrow the field, keep moving. She had never encountered a problem that did not eventually resolve under sufficient pressure and intelligence, and she saw no reason to believe this one would be different. What she did not yet understand, and would not understand for several more days, was that the answer had been sitting on Cedar Street for 4 years, under a sign that had not been repainted since the previous owner, waiting for exactly this problem the way certain tools wait in drawers for the one job they were built to do. It did not advertise itself. It did not need to. Reed Automotive occupied a 2-bay building on the east end of Cedar Street between a dry cleaner and a hardware store that had been trying to close for 3 years. The sign above the door was painted directly on the wood, dark blue letters on white, no logo, no tagline. The parking lot held 4 spaces and a crooked basketball hoop someone had bolted to a telephone pole years ago and never removed. From the outside it looked like exactly what it was, a small, unglamorous place where cars were fixed for reasonable prices by people who knew what they were doing. From the inside it was something else entirely. The floor was sealed epoxy in pale gray, clean enough to eat from. The tool cabinets along the back wall were arranged by function and dimension with a precision that looked almost aggressive. Every surface was organized the way a surgical room is organized. Nothing placed casually, nothing left where it did not belong. Measurements were verified before they were relied upon. Documentation was kept on every vehicle that came through the bays. A car that left Reed Automotive left in better condition than it arrived, and every person who had ever brought a vehicle there knew that what they were paying for was not simply labor but exactness. The shop had no reviews posted anywhere, no referral program, and a waiting list that moved at its own pace regardless of how urgently the person calling believed their situation to be. Diana Flores had worked there for 2 years and still found it quietly unsettling on slow mornings when there were no cars to disrupt the geometry of the place. She was sitting at the front desk that Wednesday with a mug of coffee and a stack of invoices when the phone rang, and the voice on the other end asked about a diagnostic inspection for a vehicle described only as a specialty European sports car. Diana asked for the make and model. There was a brief pause, and then the caller said it. Diana wrote it on a notepad with careful handwriting, thanked the caller, confirmed the appointment for Friday at 2 in the afternoon, and set the phone down. Then she walked through the door to the service bay and crouched beside the rear wheel arch of the Porsche 911 that was currently elevated on the left side lift. She could see Caleb's forearms below the chassis. She read him the make and model off the notepad in the same neutral tone she used for everything. Caleb Reed did not move for 4 seconds. His hands, which had been positioned at a particular bolt with the ease of someone who had performed this action hundreds of times, stayed exactly where they were. Then he finished the turn, set the wrench down on the drop cloth, and slid out from under the car. He stood without urgency and looked at the notepad she was holding, then at the calendar on the wall. He told her to confirm the appointment, standard diagnostic rate, no deposit required, no concessions on timing. Diana studied his face in the way she had learned to over 2 years of working beside him. She went back to the front desk and confirmed. What Diana knew about Caleb Reed's past she had not learned from him directly. She had assembled it slowly, from pieces he had let slip during long afternoons when the shop was quiet, and the work was the kind that allowed for conversation without demanding it. She knew he had spent nearly a decade in automotive engineering before Cedar Street, at the highest level of the industry, at a facility in northern Italy whose name she recognized immediately when he mentioned it once and never mentioned again. She knew his wife had died 4 years ago, and that whatever the circumstances of that loss had been, they were not something he had any intention of explaining to anyone. She knew the move to Cedar Street had been a deliberate choice. Not a fall, not a failure, but a withdrawal. The kind of withdrawal that has nothing to do with defeat and everything to do with survival. He did not have regrets about the career he had stepped away from, or if he did, he had organized them into something too compact and private to be visible. He had rebuilt himself on Cedar Street into someone who served the work rather than the industry, who was respected by every customer who came through the door and known by none of them beyond the quality of what he delivered. She had the good sense to respect it completely, and in return Caleb trusted her in the specific and limited way that solitary people trust the few individuals they choose to keep close. He looked at the calendar one more time before going back to the Porsche. The appointment was written in her handwriting. G. Voss, Friday, 2 p.m. The car carrier arrived at 2 minutes before 2. Diana watched it from the front window, a flatbed truck pulling a low loader with the Ferrari strapped carefully in the center, covered at the hood and rear with soft-fitted cloth. Behind it came a black SUV with tinted windows, and behind that a second SUV. 3 people stepped out before Giselle Voss stepped out. They fanned out in a way that was not quite security and not quite staff but something that occupied the uncomfortable space between both. Giselle herself emerged last, adjusting the cuff of her blazer as she took in Reed Automotive with an expression that was not hostile but was absolutely not impressed. She was 35 with the kind of composure that read as coldness until you looked at her eyes, which were performing a continuous and rapid assessment of everything in her field of vision simultaneously. She looked at the building, the sign, the parking lot, the visible equipment through the open bay door. She had stood in front of far more impressive facilities and had not been convinced by any of them. She crossed the lot toward Caleb, who had walked out with a shopcloth in one hand and nothing in the other, and she did not offer her hand. She opened with the facts. 6 inspection teams, no fault identified, escalating costs and 0 results. Ryan Ashford had suggested 1 additional consultation before she made the final decision about the vehicle's status, and she was here because she respected the principle of exhausting options even when she did not expect results from them. She said all of this in the even, practiced cadence of someone who has given many briefings. When she finished, she looked at Caleb and waited for the standard performance of confidence, the reassurance, the upward adjustment in posture that men in his position typically produced when faced with a woman who had more money than them and was not hiding it. Caleb did none of those things. He looked past her at the car for a moment. Then he asked her one question. Under what specific driving conditions had the engine cut out? A straight section of road or during a directional change? Giselle stopped. She replayed the question in her mind. Not because it was complicated, but because in 3 weeks and 6 consultations no one had asked it. She told him, straight road, constant speed, no steering input, no gradient change. He nodded once. He said nothing else. He walked toward the carrier. He circled the car twice without touching it, his hands at his sides, his pace unhurried. Giselle followed at a distance, watching him the way you watch someone perform an action you do not recognize but sense is purposeful. One of her assistants began to speak, and she raised 2 fingers without looking at him. He stopped. Caleb reached the right side air intake behind the passenger door and crouched beside it. He tilted his head toward the intake opening. He stayed in that position for a long time, longer than seemed necessary for any inspection Diana had witnessed, and she was watching from the doorway with her coffee mug in both hands. Then Caleb straightened and turned to Diana and said one word in a language that was not English. Risonanza. He said it quietly, the way someone says a word that solves something. Diana knew what it meant. Giselle did not, but she caught the shift in his posture and took 2 steps forward. She asked him what he had just said. Caleb did not answer the question directly. He asked instead whether the vehicle's original factory technical documentation had accompanied the car today. Not the owner's manual, the original build record documentation. Giselle's assistant glanced at another assistant. No one had thought to bring it. Giselle's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes moved. She told her team to retrieve it from the facility by end of day. Caleb looked at her steadily and said he would need 48 hours, that the vehicle would remain in his bay during that time, and that he preferred to work without her representative present on site. He did not say Ryan Ashford's name. He said, "Your representative." Giselle looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Fine." It was the first time in 3 weeks she had said that word and believed it. The shop was locked to the public by 6 that evening, but the lights inside stayed on until past midnight. Caleb worked alone except for Diana, who had offered to stay and sat near the tool bench with her laptop doing invoices and not asking questions. The Ferrari sat in the center bay with its right side access panels removed, the car's inner architecture exposed under the shop's overhead lights with the kind of clinical detail that made it look simultaneously more beautiful and more vulnerable than it did sealed and painted and whole. Caleb moved through the disassembly with a methodical ease that required no consultation, no reference manual, no pause to think. He worked from memory the way surgeons work, with the confidence of someone whose knowledge of the structure is so complete that the structure itself holds no surprises. Diana watched him from the corner of her eye when she thought he was not paying attention. She had seen him work on complex machinery before. She had not seen him work like this. His movements had a quality she had no precise word for. Not speed, not skill exactly, but something closer to fluency, the way a native speaker moves through a language without translating. The HY Kerr's integration module sat at the junction between the combustion engine and the electric drive system, a component that most technicians never touched because most technicians never needed to. Caleb reached it by removing a secondary heat shield and a bracket assembly that was not visible in any publicly available service document. The modules sat in its housing, visually unremarkable, and nested inside its lower channel was the pressure regulation valve, a component roughly the size of a man's thumb, made of a titanium alloy developed specifically for this application. To an untrained eye, it looked perfect. To Caleb Reed, it looked like what it was, the source. He explained it to Diana without her asking, speaking quietly as he worked. The valve was designed to modulate pressure between the hybrid and combustion systems at extremely precise intervals, but under a specific convergence of temperature, road speed, and load, a convergence that happened to occur on a straight flat road at constant velocity on a warm afternoon. The valve was capable of producing a resonance frequency in the low-end acoustic range. That frequency caused a microvibration in its own mounting bracket. That vibration, lasting less than 20 milliseconds, was sufficient to interrupt the signal pathway between the HY-KERS module and the engine control unit. The interruption did not register in the ECU log because it fell below the system's minimum threshold for fault recording. The engine experienced it not as a malfunction but as a command. It shut down cleanly. It left no evidence. Diana looked up from her laptop and asked how anyone was supposed to find that. Caleb said that was exactly the right question. He told her about the recall. Not in general terms, in specific ones. The valve's design characteristic had been identified during post-production quality analysis of the 47th through 52nd units of the 210-unit production run. A small internal working group at the Maranello facility had documented the issue, calculated the probability of failure under real-world driving conditions, and prepared a corrective action report. The report recommended a silent replacement program for the affected units. 6 cars whose owners would be contacted individually, would bring their vehicles in under the guise of a routine service check, and would leave with the corrected part installed and no paperwork that described what had actually been done. It was the kind of protocol that large manufacturers use when a flaw is real enough to correct but narrow enough not to constitute a safety crisis. Caleb had written that report. He had been the senior integration engineer responsible for the HY-KERS system on the Ferrari program. And when the characteristic emerged in post-production data, he had been the one who identified it, documented it, and specified the corrective path. The replacement program had been initiated internally, but the owner notification process for units 47 through 52 had been delayed, first by internal review, then by a reorganization within the service division. The notifications had not gone out before he left the company, and they had apparently not reached Giselle Voss in the years since. He set down the tool he was holding and was quiet for a moment. Then he looked more closely at the valve in its housing, not at its function but at its physical orientation. He produced a small beam flashlight and angled it across the surface of the mounting bracket. There was a mark on the adjustment bolt. Not damage, not wear. A rotation mark, the kind left by a tool applying deliberate torque. He measured the current angle of the bolt against the specification he carried in memory. 1/8 of a turn out of position. Enough to shift the resonance onset to a lower speed threshold, to guarantee the failure would occur under more common driving conditions, to ensure it would manifest within weeks rather than the months it might otherwise have taken. He took photographs. He got a micrometer from the cabinet and took measurements. He wrote the figures on a clean notepad, double-checked them, and sat back on his heels. The mark was recent, 6 months at the outside. The tool that had made it was specialized calibration equipment, not a garage tool, not something a casual visitor carries. Diana was watching him from across the room. She asked what he was thinking. He told her he was thinking about who had been close enough to that car, recently enough, with enough knowledge of what they were doing, to adjust one bolt by 1/8 of a turn and know exactly what it would accomplish. Ryan Ashford arrived at Reed Automotive the following afternoon without an appointment. He drove himself, which was unusual for a man who was routinely driven as a matter of professional habit. He came through the door in a charcoal suit that was too formal for a garage on Cedar Street, carrying nothing and smiling with the kind of warmth that comes from practice rather than feeling. He told Diana he was checking on progress on behalf of Ms. Voss and hoped he was not interrupting. She said Caleb was in the back and went to find him. Ryan stood in the front room and looked around with the patient, unhurried manner of someone who is not actually interested in what he is looking at but is gathering information about it nonetheless. When Caleb emerged, he was wearing no particular expression. Ryan extended his hand. Caleb shook it. The two men stood in the small front room and regarded each other with the specific courtesy of people who have decided simultaneously and without discussion that they do not trust each other. Neither acknowledged this. Both were aware of it. Ryan asked how the inspection was progressing and whether anything significant had come to light. Caleb said there was nothing to report at this stage. Ryan nodded with the expression of a man who has received the answer he expected and finds it neither troubling nor reassuring. He asked, almost as an afterthought, whether the fault appeared to be mechanical or electronic in nature, because Ms. Voss would want to know which direction the analysis was pointing. Caleb said diagnostics of this kind required time and that preliminary conclusions would be misleading. Ryan accepted that with another nod. He spent 4 more minutes in the shop, asked 2 additional questions of no particular depth, and left, telling Caleb to contact Ms. Voss directly when there was something definitive. After the sound of his car had faded from the street, Diana turned from the window and said, "You just lied to him." Caleb was already walking back toward the bay. He said he had told him there was nothing to report. He said, "There isn't. I haven't written the report." Diana followed him to the bay doorway and stood there a moment looking at the car. She had worked enough hours beside Caleb Reed to recognize the difference between a man who is thinking and a man who has already thought. He was the second kind. She went back to her desk and opened her laptop, and this time she was not looking at invoices. She spent the next 2 hours reading everything publicly available about Voss Industries, its pending restructuring, and its IPO timeline. She read analyst commentary on the expected valuation. She read 3 months of coverage on Ryan Ashford, his internal governance proposals, the ones that had been formally submitted and recorded but not passed, each one designed to shift decision-making authority incrementally away from Giselle's direct control and toward a collective model that Ryan would be positioned to influence. She read 2 profile pieces that described him as patient, meticulous, and long-term in his thinking. She read the media coverage following Giselle's public statement about the car and noticed that 3 of the resulting articles had quietly shifted story from a mechanical mystery to a question of whether the CEO of a company approaching a major public offering was managing her affairs with the consistency investors would require. The framing had been subtle. It had also been consistent across outlets. She did not know for certain who had fed that framing. She understood the shape of it well enough. She closed the laptop and went back into the bay and stood beside Caleb and said quietly he needed her distracted. He needed her to look like she was losing control of something visible. Caleb picked up a tool and said, "A car is the most visible thing she owns." Diana thought about that. Then she said, "1 bolt." Caleb said, "1 bolt." Caleb called Giselle Voss on Thursday morning and asked for an evening meeting at the shop, in person without her team. He said he had a complete finding and that it required a direct conversation. There was a silence on the line long enough for him to hear her deciding. Then she said she would be there at 8. She arrived 4 minutes early, alone, in a car she drove herself. She was wearing less formal clothes than in any of their previous interactions. Dark trousers, a gray jacket, no jewelry visible. She looked like someone who had decided to show up as herself rather than as her title. Caleb met her in the bay where the Ferrari sat with its panels still removed, its interior laid open under the shop's overhead light. He led her to the right side of the car, positioned her where the light fell correctly, and began to explain. He walked her through the valve's function, the resonance failure mode, and the conditions under which it had been activating. He translated the technical elements into language that was precise without being condescending, the way you speak to someone who is intelligent and has simply not encountered this particular domain before. Giselle listened without interrupting. She asked 2 clarifying questions at precise moments, both of which showed she had fully understood everything preceding them. Then Caleb brought her to the bolt. He showed her the photographs, held a magnifier to the bracket so she could see the rotation mark herself, and explained what the angle deviation meant in terms of failure onset timing. He told her what the adjusted valve had accomplished. He told her it had been done deliberately by someone with specific technical knowledge of this subsystem within the past 6 months. He did not say Ryan's name. He said, "The person who did this understood precisely what they were setting in motion." Jackson Webb arrived at 8:45, let in by Diana, and introduced himself as an independent technical examiner with 30 years of certification work. He had brought a case of instruments and a prepared examination form. He spent 20 minutes with the bolt and valve housing, took his own photographs and measurements, and signed the technical findings document that Caleb had prepared. He noted the deliberate adjustment, characterized it as intentional mechanical interference, and dated the window of the action based on oxidation of the tool marks. The document was 3 pages and would hold up in any proceeding that required it. While Jackson was working, Giselle's phone registered a notification. She read it. She read it again. Ryan Ashford had sent a message to 3 members of the Voss Industries Board of Directors requesting an urgent meeting to discuss leadership capacity in advance of the IPO timeline. The message had been sent 40 minutes ago. The timing communicated everything it needed to communicate. Giselle looked at Caleb with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite devastation, but contained both at a temperature that made the room feel smaller. She stepped outside. Caleb could hear the low, even cadence of her voice through the gap in the bay door. Not raised, not breaking, but moving with the precision of someone deploying force carefully and without waste. She was on the phone for 11 minutes. Jackson finished his documentation and looked at Caleb over the top of his glasses and said, "The woman is going to be fine." It was a statement of observation, not reassurance. When Giselle came back inside, her posture had returned to its natural steadiness, though something behind it had been permanently adjusted. She looked at the car for a moment. Then she asked Caleb how he had known what to look for. He told her about the recall, about the production run, about the internal report he had written 4 years ago before he left the company. He told her simply, without drama, the way you tell someone a relevant fact that happens to involve your own history. He told her the notification had not reached her because the process had stalled inside the service division after his departure, and that Ryan had apparently researched the affected production units carefully enough to identify the vulnerability before any of the 6 inspection teams had found it, and had used that information at the moment of maximum effect. Giselle was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You wrote that report." It was not a question. He said yes. She looked at the car. Then she said, "Ryan didn't create the flaw. He found out it was there and chose the right moment to make it worse." Caleb said nothing. She was right, and they both understood it completely. Ryan Ashford received a phone call from Giselle Voss at 10:17 that evening. The call lasted 4 minutes and did not require a follow-up. Monday arrived on Cedar Street with the quiet regularity of a morning that does not know what preceded it. The dry cleaner opened 2 doors down. The delivery truck made its first pass. The early light came in flat and clear through the east-facing window of the service bay and laid itself across the epoxy floor in long pale rectangles that moved slowly as the hour advanced. It was the kind of morning that asked nothing of anyone. The kind that Caleb had relied on for 4 years to remind him that ordinary days had a value that extraordinary ones could not replace. He arrived at 6:45 as he always did, made coffee in the back room, checked the day's work list against the parts that had come in, and began without ceremony. The replacement valve had arrived on Friday through Jackson's supply contact, the correct part, the correct specification sourced through a fully documented legitimate channel. It sat in its packaging on the center workbench, waiting with the patience of an object that has no awareness of how much is riding on it. Diana arrived at 7:30, said nothing for the first 10 minutes, and positioned herself where she could see without being in the way. She had learned long ago that the most useful thing she could do when Caleb was doing work that mattered was to be present without creating friction. Caleb worked through the installation the way he worked through everything, with the unhurried precision of someone for whom this kind of work is not performance but instinct. The valve seated into its housing at the correct angle and torque, the bracket closed cleanly, the heat shield returned in proper sequence, and then the secondary panel, and then the exterior access cover. Each step completed the one before it with no revision and no backtracking. When the last fastener was closed and Caleb straightened up and set the torque wrench on the bench, the car looked exactly as it had when it arrived, sealed, whole, and unmarked by what had been found inside it or taken from it. Diana studied the finished surface for a moment. The car simply looked like a car again. She thought that was its own kind of achievement. Giselle arrived at 9. She came alone. She walked into the bay and looked at the car and then at Caleb without speaking. He handed her the key. She sat in the driver's seat with both hands on the wheel and her eyes forward and did not move for a moment. Then she started the engine. The hybrid system initialized in its sequence, the combustion engine engaged, and the idle note settled into the low and complex harmonic that is the acoustic signature of a Ferrari at rest, a sound that is not quite mechanical and not quite musical but occupies the precise space between both. There was no vibration. There was no hesitation. The resonance that had been building in the valve housing for months was simply gone, as though it had never been introduced. Giselle listened with her eyes closed for several seconds. Caleb stood to the side and let her have the moment entirely. Diana stood in the doorway and said nothing. The car made the sound it was supposed to make, and that was the whole of what anyone needed to say. They took it out onto the access road behind the shop, a quarter-mile of smooth pavement that Caleb kept for post-service verification. Giselle drove. Caleb sat in the passenger seat and felt the car do precisely what it had always been designed to do. She ran it through 3 passes at increasing speed, held it at constant velocity on the 4th, the exact conditions of the original failure, and nothing happened except what was meant to. The engine held its register. The response was immediate and clean. The car was, without qualification, itself again. When they returned to the bay and she shut the engine off, there was a quality of silence that had not been present in the shop 3 weeks ago. The kind that settles when something unfinished becomes finished, and the air can stop holding its breath. She got out and picked up the invoice from the workbench where Diana had left it. She read it without any change of expression. It was the standard rate for the service performed, parts at cost, labor at the shop's posted hours, diagnostic time at the standard fee. No adjustment had been made for circumstance or outcome. Giselle looked at the figure, then at Caleb. She paid the exact amount stated and said nothing about it. That restraint was its own form of respect, and he recognized it as such. She folded her hands in front of her and told him that Ryan Ashford had submitted his resignation by email on Friday evening. The 3 board members who had received his message had, after reviewing the technical documentation forwarded by Giselle's legal team, withdrawn their interest in the proposed emergency meeting. The IPO timeline was unchanged. She delivered this information the way you give someone the outcome of a situation they help to resolve, without theater, without score settling, with only the facts themselves. Then she said something different. She said she had 8 other vehicles in the climate-controlled facility and had been managing their service requirements through rotating specialists who were each competent within their particular range but lacked the breadth to understand the collection as a whole. She said she was not offering a job. She was offering an arrangement, independent on his terms, scheduled around the operations of this shop, with full authority to decline any task he chose not to take on. She said she had learned in the past week that there was exactly one person in this city qualified to do what she was describing, and she preferred to ask him directly rather than construct a search for someone who might appear equivalent. She let the offer stand on its own without further argument. Caleb looked at her for a moment. He looked at the Ferrari sitting in the center of the bay, sealed and clean and running correctly again. He looked out through the open bay door at the street, the dry cleaner, the crooked basketball hoop, the ordinary gray morning that was the world he had built for himself on purpose and had defended for 4 years. Then he looked back at Giselle and said, "Let me think about it." She nodded. She said she would wait. Her tone made clear she was not speaking about the next few minutes. She drove out of the parking lot and turned north onto Cedar Street, and the car's note diminished and then disappeared between the buildings, and then it was just Cedar Street again, as it had always been. The dry cleaner's sign reflected a bit of light. The crooked basketball hoop stood at its permanent imperfect angle above the telephone pole. Nothing about the street had changed. Everything about the morning felt different in a way that Caleb was not prepared to examine in too much detail, not yet. Caleb stood in the doorway and watched until the road was empty. Diana came and stood beside him with the last of her morning coffee. She asked, "Are you going to call her?" He said, "I don't know." She said, "You know." He said nothing. They stood there a moment in the early quiet of a street that had no particular opinion about what happened next. Caleb went inside. He picked up his phone, found the number in his recent calls, and looked at it for a long moment. The number was just a number. The conversation it would start was something else entirely. A door that, once opened, would connect Cedar Street to a world he had deliberately walked away from 4 years ago, and he was not entirely certain the man he had become on this street was the same man who had left that world, or whether those 2 versions of himself could coexist in the same life without one of them giving way. He thought about that for a moment. Then he set the phone back on the bench. He went to pour himself another cup of coffee. The morning was still early, the day had a full list of work in it, and that was sufficient for now. But the number was where it was, and it was not going anywhere, and Cedar Street, for the first time in a long while, felt less like a place a person retreats to and more like a place a person stands in before deciding what comes next. Which is not the same as nothing at all. It is, if anything, the beginning of something.